Thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's roundtable on outsourcing for subscription businesses, the what, when and how. This roundtable is brought to you by Renewed, the open network for specialized subscription, membership and event professionals. My name is Sue Stevens and I'm the Executive Director for Renewed Europe, and I'll be moderating today's event. Please keep yourself on mute to minimize background noise. Do turn on your videos if you can. It makes a huge difference to see some faces. And please put your name and company in the box so we know who's asking questions. If you have any questions for today's speakers, you can submit them throughout the presentation and at the end during the Q&A session by using the chat function. After the presentation, you'll have access to the recording and slides, and we'll send you an email with the link once that's available online. On today's session, I'd like to introduce you to our host, Matthew Robinson. Matthew is the Commercial Director for Cognition Solutions. Cognition leverages technology and their sector knowledge to build, manage, monitor, and analyze data, insights, and content for businesses large and small around the world. Their services help companies increase revenue, develop new product lines, redefine their markets, and stay ahead of the competition. Matthew will be talking to Rupert Collins White of Burlington Media Group, and I'm going to leave it to Matthew. So Matthew, over to you to introduce Rupert and get going.
Hello, everyone. Sue, thank you very much. And thank you to those members of the Renewed community who've been able to join. Really appreciate it. Not sure leave it to Matthew is always the most convincing or reassuring way to start anything, but thank you, Sue. I do appreciate that. Yeah, I'm Commercial Director for Cognition Solutions. Sue's just done a really great summary of who we are, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I will just add one little thing really, or two little things. We've been in business for just over 20 years, and we work with quite a wide range of companies, pretty much in all sectors, but the company was originally founded to help event companies and business intelligence and other sort of related publications with their core audiences. That's still very much a key part of our kind of business, and yeah, you know, it's a space that we understand pretty well. So I'm just going to quickly introduce, or let Rupert introduce himself as well, and just to say thank you again, Rupert, for helping. Rupert, if you'd just like to do a quick introduction for yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm Rupert. I am co-CEO of Burlington Media Group. I look better in that photo than I do in real life, as all photos should. Burlington Media Group is a small sort of publishing, online and events business, B2B only, and we sort of cover the legal sector from a management standpoint rather than talking about lawyers. So we have a couple of subscription style brands. One sells data called Unicorn. One is a like marketing syndication brand called Legal Support Network, or LSN, and that we sort of have a newsletter base and a website on which we push content marketing from our client base that are vendors to the legal market. And we have two media brands called Briefing and LPM, and they are slightly more traditional in the sense that you understand what they are in terms of magazine events and online sort of brands for big and small managers in big and small law firms.
Okay, Rupert, thank you very much, much appreciated. So I'll just come through to the agenda in a moment, but just before I do that, I thought it's quite useful just to set a little bit of kind of context around, if you like, the overarching objectives of what we're trying to achieve. So often when we're talking to our clients, pretty much any kind of capacity, really one of the major things they're always trying to sort of solve or be better at is kind of just understanding their customers really as best as possible, and really being in a capacity to treat those guys as individuals, and also obviously making sure that whatever particular product or service that they're trying to, you know, engage with those people is as aligned as it possibly can, and really ultimate gain of making your clients as happy as they can possibly be. So we're looking really at ways that potentially can sort of free up time and headspace towards that objective. And actually, as I think on about it just a little bit more, I think within your own teams, it's quite useful to be able to sort of free up headspace just in terms of making people feel sort of happier, better engaged with what they're doing. So I think there's, as we go through it, I think there's quite a lot of sort of additional kind of benefits that come apparent, and I think that will be the case as we look at some of the case studies that we've prepared as well. So in terms of just a quick run through for the agenda, we've got a couple of ideas around sort of process outsourcing versus kind of strategic partnership or co-sourcing, and I'm going to come on and sort of define what those differences are, and then we're going to look at some of our case studies as well. And what we try to do here is kind of align them with how we're helping with sort of product data, just basically making data-driven, all those data elements of products better. Data and analytics, and that's really about engaging with audience. Market intelligence, so just understanding what kind of opportunities are, whether there is an opportunity, whether that sort of orange is worth squeezing, so to speak. And then also looking at editorial and content, which is primarily aligned with how we're helping Rupert at Burlington and his team. And we've sort of compiled quite a number of kind of questions that we get asked all the time, and but we actually also ask part of our own outsourced supply network. And I think one of the things that we'd like you guys to be able to take away from this is just a checklist of questions and approaches that you want to ask any co-sourcing partner. And again, I think actually some of these questions, I wouldn't go so far as to say they're sort of existential questions, but I think they help people frame in their own minds whether outsourcing is a good idea for them, you know, so it helps with that aspect of it as well. So I hope we get some sort of benefit from that. And then we're going to talk sort of firsthand with Rupert about the kind of processes he went through, what was in his and his team's you know, thinking around this, and hopefully there's going to be some real value for you guys in terms of you know, hearing from an actual end user, if you like. And of course we're going to allow some time for Q&A. I think just in terms of questions, we're quite happy to field questions as we go along, and I think Sue's going to sort of flag up anything that we need, but I will stop quite regularly and ask if anybody wants to contribute or you know, ask questions, etc. So I think it's interesting, when Rupert and I were first sort of discussing this, one of the things that he was talking about was when you have kind of editorial or journalist-based businesses, actually they're arguably at the vanguard of outsourcing, because for as long as there've been journalists and editors, there've been freelancers. So I think very well positioned in that area. But I just thought it's quite interesting to make two distinctions really within the outsourcing kind of market. So I think most people have a pretty good understanding of outsourcing in terms of the, you know, those sort of day-to-day consistent processes that it's possibly no longer kind of cost-effective to have within your own sort of four walls. And, you know, typically things like kind of your invoicing functions or those types of things. And that's kind of a kind of regular month in, month out, this needs to be done, pretty well understood, I think. And obviously you tend to get sort of cost reduction or efficiency gains from doing that. I think the way that we understand co-sourcing, the way we try and work with our partners is, but it's much more of a sort of two-way street. And we are trying to be involved in a very sort of consultative way to sort of really understand the problem statements before we get in there. And also a lot of the situations that we work in tend to evolve, not always entirely in the way that we were first expecting. I've got some examples of that, and how that has, you know, been largely been a positive thing. But I'm just going to try and give as sort of warts as all as I can. So the first kind of areas that I wanted to look at, these are quite similar in some ways, but with Simmons, Boardman, and Energy Aspects. So Simmons Boardman publishing company, they specialize in the rail sector, and they have quite an extensive database of railway projects globally. And the way that was being managed before we became involved was the editorial team were using those, were sort of updating it as they went along. And it's, you know, I suppose it's pretty obviously a kind of painting the Severn Bridge kind of task, you know, where it's never ending, and just they weren't really able to devote their time in the way that they wanted, you know, writing better stories or adding more value to the sort of intelligence products. So we actually deployed a team who could actively research rail projects from sort of instigation right through completion, and to make sure that those were being updated in a very timely way. So the immediate impact of that was an increase in the efficacy and value of that data set. However, I think one of the things that we hadn't anticipated is that we're very good at getting the data points correct, and we work with them to make sure that we're understanding those correctly. But it turned out each project had a little bit of context around it, and we were really initially struggling to get the context correct, the way that we were writing that aligned to the editorial standard of IRJ. So we were then creating another problem, really, because the editorial team couldn't keep up with the pace at which we were providing the updated data points. So we actually took a step back and really worked with them to define a style guide, got that in place, and that sort of problem was solved quite neatly, I think, in the end. But I think aside from the kind of obvious benefit to their subscribers of having, a more comprehensive data set that they could use, I think one of the key benefits that we hadn't really thought of at the time is that we were getting a much better, much richer picture of who the stakeholders in the different railway projects actually are. And that enabled them to quite rapidly expand the type and number of companies that they were talking to about being subscribers in the first place. And I think as a salesperson, I should probably have realized that that was going to be a benefit right from the start. To my shame, I didn't, and that kind of evolved as we were working with them. And I think that's quite a neat example of, once you start working in you want to have that sort of consultative relationship with a partner. And as I said, and then you will often find kind of additional benefits for whatever you're doing. Energy aspects, in a way, is actually quite similar in terms of they have a database, but in this instance, it was to do with chemical plants. And we work very closely with their analysts to make sure that we are understanding the interpretation of data around chemical plants and their output. And it took quite a long time to sort of substantiate that we were doing that correctly. And I think that's another factor, there's quite an intense process at the beginning where it can sometimes feel like it's actually more work than you were doing before. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. It's sort of worth powering through that. But I think what is quite interesting about this is that they were trying to answer the question internally, can you have that portion of analyst kind of experience and an expertise in a sort of third party to allow your actual very highly paid analysts to be adding value to that information rather than finding it in the first place. And I think we were able to prove that was the case, that you could do that. But they were actually then able to use working with ours as quite a low risk way of establishing that you could actually do that in an in-house sort of nearshore capacity. So they actually then went on to set up their own research center in a different cost base and have brought the whole process back in-house. So I think it's quite important to realize that, whatever you're doing doesn't necessarily have to be forever, and you're not actually necessarily, I think quite often a sort of common fear is that you're going to lose that expertise in-house. I'm just going to pause and ask if there are any questions or any point anybody would like to make at this sort of juncture.
Nothing's come through on chat yet,
Okay.
but do post your questions on chat if you do, or if you see anything that you'd like to talk about. Okay.
So we're looking on sort of how we've been helping companies with their sort of data analytics and kind of better understanding their sort of marketplaces. We have Wood Mackenzie, their business intelligence company, again in the energy space. The majority of their clients are, or big clients, are either energy majors or bulge bracket banks, pardon me. And quite an interesting challenge because they'd worked out, and I'm sure this is the case for many companies, that the sort of vast majority of their revenues were actually coming from sort of 16 key accounts. And what they were very concerned about is that those accounts were restructuring to meet their own net zero commitments. And I think the big challenge that they came to us with is we're very concerned that these accounts kind of restructuring, that the whole kind of decision making and influencing unit around having our products and reports is all going to sort of shift. And it's actually incredibly difficult with the resources we have in-house to kind of look at what the new strategy for these client companies is going to be, and then how we can then realign that with the right, to make sure our account managers are pitching in the right mix of products and services to the right people. And so we actually were able to create with them a number of sort of stakeholder maps to show what the companies are going to look like. And again, I just think, the capacity to have that in-house is kind of, sort of quite limited. And then the other thing that I just wanted to really point out in terms of kind of, other processes with the events company, so I can't give you the name of this particular company, but where we're building sort of the significant audience data for their online events, they needed to have quite a serious kind of data analyst, data scientist team to look at those pools which were most responsive. And again, there's just no capacity in-house really to be able to do that. So we're able to we just provide that service as a value add, actually. So just really enabled them to build data in those data sets that have the highest propensity, if you like, for being involved in the particular product or service. The next one, well, so any questions on that point? I'm just
No, I was just going to say for myself, so those two projects that you've spoken about, would that have been sort of one-off projects, so not necessarily an ongoing relationship? Then, you went in for one specific reason.
Okay. Well, with that, we have one of each. So with Wood Mackenzie, this was a specific project to realign the key account approach to take advantage of or be aligned to the change in strategy for net zero commitments. And with the events company, it's an ongoing relationship that we've had over multiple years, but it's continually evolving. And I would say that this providing the different services within that in terms of data scientists, in this particular example, is something where that's been a sort of temporary bit, if you like, but to support the ongoing service. Is that okay, or to elaborate on that at all? Okay. So the next one I thought might be quite interesting to look at is around market and sort of competitor intelligence. So this is a leading event company. They host, it's actually a venue. They host events, but they also run their own. And they had very limited capacity in-house to look at competitor intelligence and also to do sort of fundamental market research intelligence. And I think they were working on the basis that, somebody says something's a good idea, there's a lot of talk about things, so on and so forth. I mean, those are all good indicators that something is quite an interesting topic area. But they just didn't have the capacity to validate that in any way. So that was kind of the first challenge. And the second was really how to break it down into a sort of step-by-step process, because they didn't want to just commit to launching something. They wanted to be able to go through a whole validated process, which would allow them to manage their time risks and their capital expenditure risks as they're going through. And we work with them to develop a series of go, no-go points with really very limited expense to start with. We're talking sort of £1,500 kind of range to get going. So I don't want to slip into sales, but I just want to give you some context about how you don't want to, can manage your financial risk quite easily here. So, you know, is the idea valid? Once you've established that the idea is valid, who are the key players likely to be both in your audience and your kind of sponsor profiles? We can then sort of move and help conduct interviews, so on and so forth. So we're just kind of building the blocks for them in a very systematic, very defined way. And I think where this plays into the outsourcing aspect is now they're outsourcing the whole idea validation process to us. I think, you know, that's potentially a very interesting idea, and sort of, you know, naturally fills into data build, so on and so forth. But yeah. So any questions around that, or?
Nothing yet. I think that's interesting way of looking at it. Carry on.
Okay. If we move on to the editorial and content side of things, we're obviously going to talk to Rupert about Burlington in a minute, but with the defense company, again, you know, what they were really interested in doing, it's being able to create quickly and easily valid kind of newsletters. So again, you know, do you want your kind of key editorial people focusing on that, or is there a process where you can get it done in a very kind of quick, comprehensive, and well-researched ways? So we've actually we work with them to develop an AI program that would collate that information in a way that they could then just top and tail. Rupert, I'm quite conscious that everybody's been hearing quite a lot of me speaking, so it might be nice to bring you in at this point. And Rupert, we've been working with you obviously in terms of you know, largely sort of content support. But I think it'd be quite useful if you give us some, you know, color around why you first sort of decided to do this, why you're open to having this kind of conversation, and sort of what prompted that.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, of course. This would be the moment I did preempt them. This is the moment when I've got builders in my house, and this is the first time in the entire day they decided to use the hammer drill downstairs. So this is, of course, the moment when they do this. Is 2 seconds before he says that. So apologies if there's any noises off. Yeah. So what we did was we started working with Matthew a couple of years ago, and ultimately we have, as I said, we have 4 brands. One of the brands, LSN, the business model is that we have, you know, something like 80 something clients that are vendors to the legal market, and what it does is that we have a newsletter sort of audience, and then we kind of they give us, all of the vendors give us content that they need, that's marketing content that's relevant to the legal market, and then we kind of re-promote that through legal support networks. So we're kind of like a content aggregator for PR and marketing for people in the legal market. And what have been, we've been doing this. This was the origin brand, really. So we've been doing this for a long time. And the reality is that, I mean, I remember hiring the first person beyond me who was uploading content and doing stuff on the site a long time ago. And we'd always hired someone whose main job was uploading content to LSN with some other stuff on the side, as well as other people in the business who were uploading content. But the other brands were less digital, really, and they were quite magazine focused. And a time came, so I think it was after the pandemic, when, or it could have been just before. You have to remind me, Matthew, when I just thought, this is just crazy. We were thinking, I don't want to have to keep hiring. This problem is that it's not, you know, we had a lot of work on content uploading. We'd always hire this person. They'd never really stayed because it wasn't, you know, it wasn't the wildly most exciting job in the business to do. There wasn't a lot of progression out of that role, really, unless you went over to editorial. And ultimately a marketing role, but it was essential. And so either we came to the point where I'm thinking, well, I don't want to rehire this role. I don't want to, and you can't really give it to other people. So your choice was, can I give someone content uploading to the marketing execs as alongside their other things, or can we do this, or can I hire a freelancer? And just didn't fit the freelancer model at all, content uploading. It didn't feel like it. And so I knew Matthew from sort of previous, sort of not quite previous lives, but in different kind of roles that we had. And it was that moment when I realised that we'd come across Cognition before, and Matthew said, "Oh, we do this loads of stuff, but one of them is basically content uploading, what have you, for businesses." And I hadn't really considered it. And we went and looked at, can we in a sense, can we farm this out? What I didn't want to do is farm it out in a sense to a freelancer or an individual, because you kind of end up with quite reliant on that person. It's almost as much hassle as running a full-time employee that you've got to contain and you've got to fill in if they don't do it. We had a lot of that. So if that person moved on, which that role regularly did move on, you always had like 2 months where other people in the business would be doing this work they didn't want to do. And then you also had to skill them all up on what you had to do, because there is some house style elements to it. You have to strip out stuff from what you're given. So a lot of hoo-ha. So in any given year, you'd probably have a load of hassle about that, and you'd be running that person, and they'd have to learn it, and they were never really wild about it. So it did seem like a really good option. Secondly, it's a lot cheaper. And I'll just be straight up. It's a lot cheaper to go, I've only got this content to upload. That's all I want to do. I don't want to have to hire a full-time person, get them to do that work, and then give them some other stuff to fill out their week and what have you, which are not usually very useful. There's also quite a lot of flex. Some weeks we'd get loads of content from all the vendors, and that person would just be snowed under, and then they couldn't do the other stuff that you gave them. And then other weeks you didn't get it. So it was quite variable. So it did lend itself really well to being outsourced. And we started with the LSN brand, which is all content uploading really to site, and that was very useful. Another really good thing that took away is that we had kind of transitioned the content uploading work for that brand partly into the person who was kind of the account manager for that brand. It's not very, it doesn't require a lot of people to run LSN. And you kind of free up the ability for the business to run client account management and customer success out of account management, and they don't have to worry about content uploading. They can go and ask the client base for their content, that's their job, but they're not actually having to do it. And yes, they can fill in if needs be, but they just don't need to. So you get some reliability out of that as well. And now we've moved on to the really good movement from there was we would test, in a sense, we then started to see LSN as being a test bed to go, if content uploading, farming that out, works, and we feel like it's a reliable ongoing partner, because that has to be something that's longer term. We wanted to commit to something that go, look, we're just going to do this for the foreseeable. I don't want to have to worry about restarting it. If that worked, and it had to be shown to the other people in the business, especially editorial, that it did work, that we could say, actually, on the editorial brands, a lot of their faff journalists, when you want to run a lean editorial team like we do, that actually, when you became very much more digital, which we have in the last couple of years, partly because of the pandemic and partly because we wanted to do it anyway, that's a lot more faff for editorial staff, even than production was. So, layout and InDesign. So what's been really nice is that we can now say, well, we demonstrated this. There's actually less content over on the editorial brands. Now you've got it all set up and you know what you're entering and you know how the CMS works and everything else. You can now say, hand over all your content uploading, or as much as you can, to the Cognition team, and you can devote a bit more time into actual story making and planning and adding more value. So there's definitely an add more value journey on editorial on top of what we were doing before. And the goal for me is really, I hope, to put the main body of content uploading, and some we'll always do because it needs to be a bit more tricky, but I would like to see a place where we kind of all of our regular BAU content upload stuff to site and a pending meta and everything else which we're working at the moment is all farmed out.
And Rupert, what were you most sort of worried about? There must have been some concerns when you decided to undertake this journey.
So I think in wider terms, the business's concern was probably brand impact of it not being done very well. So because that's your trading off it, and what you don't really want is someone to mess up the way that you do it. Now on LSN, what you're really doing there is basically taking the words from a vendor PR and turning it into a web content. You're probably playing around with the title, but you're not really doing anything else. But what you don't want to do is the damage is more like if you've queued it incorrectly, if something goes out earlier than it should do, if something doesn't go out when it's supposed to, then this is client work, and they're going to phone up and have a go. And so it's not just editorial that's being done. So in a weird way, we started doing this on the area of the business that could be most impacted by bad content work. It would be, so there was quite a lot, but it was the area of most need. So I think that was the general concern, rather than any kind of quality problems about what would get done, because it's not actually generation of content. It's more like, is this something that we can feel reliable? You're giving a baby away. It's not for someone else to look after. I think that's what I would sum it up as. I don't think a lot of it isn't a real fear. It's just you go, wow, I don't want to have this cock up and then I have to go to the client and say, well, actually we outsourced that. That's not gonna go well. So there was a lot of that's probably what the concern was.
So it's entirely really on what the sort of being let down and what the kind of client repercussions of that are. It's the biggest sort of risk that you were worried about. So
well, they're paying because in a sense they're paying you to do it.
Yes.
And the notion that you're going to farm this out is you have to go, well, I am having a measure of control over this, and we do want to make sure. So it was much more about, if you're delivering timely client deliverables in terms of content, then you've got to make sure that whoever does it understands that. Is a weird way, like exactly the same way as you deal with an employee. You'd have a moment when you go, this may seem small, but it is not. And you've got to have those little moments when you explain it.
And when you're explaining things to your employees and colleagues, are they happy, or how do you get them to buy into this? Because I suppose there's always a slight sense maybe that this is a slippery slope, and you're thinking about outsourcing them, for want of a better way of putting it, rather than part of it. Or was that not a consideration at all? And there's also building into that,
we were lucky that I think at the time, I think what happened is that we didn't have the resource that we were using in marketing, I think it was, or they weren't there. So we managed to start from a position where we're not actually replacing anyone with this at that time. So as usual, when a change has already happened, is a great time to do another piece of change, and that did make a lot of sense. It would have been difficult at the time to see the full value add side of it, to sell that. So I can totally see that. There's not been any problem at all in terms of selling it through editorial, because they know exactly what we're doing, because we've proved it on the brand that's all you're doing is uploading, and you're just delivering what the business would be doing anyway. So there's been no need to convince it. I think that having done it with one brand where most people were fundamentally unaffected by that, and being able to say, okay, we worked out how to do this well on LSN, that meant that we could then go to people and say, well, we've worked out the kinks, we know how they know us, we know them now. Expanding this into another brand is not going to be terribly difficult, and it wasn't particularly. I was going to point out that the real difficulty actually about that is that most of the time when you're handing this over to editorial staff, for example, to say, or production side, to say, give this to this team who's uploading content, you realize, though publishing is a very process-led sort of business, and I've been doing magazines for an awfully long time, so you love the process of getting it right and what have you. You realize that a lot of the stuff you're doing isn't very well written down and isn't very processed, and there isn't a playbook really. So what really grinds the gears of people in the editorial production is that then they've then got to explain how they do stuff to people, and they've got to process orient themselves, and they go, I've got to put this content like this, and I've got to give it to you like that, and I've got to outline it like this, and I've got to put this bit in here. And so there's a lot of, you realize how organically you work and how you've got to really understand your process and hand that over to somebody and get them to work in And so it's there's quite a lot of change, and that is a bit of a grind, because you realise that you're asking someone to do something differently and to write down and be more process oriented about how they do stuff that before they did their own way, but they were happy doing it. So I think if I was the convincing that happened, I think especially when we moved over to editorial was for them was the slight pain in having to explain it and do it in a certain way, and realize that they were doing it in a way that was probably wrong, and could have been done easier, but to at least to be more process oriented. I think that was a little bit of a hump to get over, to get them to go, stop moaning about that. The end goal is worth it. You don't have to do this. You can do something else instead.
Right, thank you. And has it made you think that there are other areas that you could look at? And also, I suppose the flip side of that, are there some things that you really would want to keep absolute control of? Or what are those areas? I suppose there are always going to be some areas you want to keep absolute control of.
Has it made us think? I mean, we do. I mean, I don't want to pain you, Matthew, but obviously, Cognition isn't the only business that we outsource stuff to, and I think that we did learn. One of the good things was, I think Cognition was certainly the first company that we'd outsourced stuff to, as I remember, and it was definitely one of those things that made me think there are things that we can do with other people. There is expertise out there. We just can't grow this expertise. So when it comes to expertise, I go, I can't hire, I can't hire all this all the time. It's a pain in the bum. I need to really think about how I can, have a core hired team. And then in a sense, you're buying in some expertise or capability. I think the difference is that at the moment we've tended to buy in from Cognition and others capability, I think. And I think the journey then is to go, where can we start buying expertise, stuff that we can't do, not just stuff that we want somewhat. We've got a partial role. We don't want to bother with partial hiring. So I think that's where the journey for me is. Not only can we do a bit more farming out of work that I don't want to have a full-time employee doing, but that journey into where are we going with certain product areas, and that this is definitely happening, where I'm not even really sure how to hire some people. And I'm thinking, for example, like people with some technical experience. So at the moment we're thinking, actually I need to go and get someone who's got some SQL and Python experience, what have you, and blah, blah, blah. And you go, I'm just not going to hire that. I'm going to have to go and speak to Cognition and other people and say, do you have people who can do this? Can I put this into a project? And I think once you've got the relationship, that makes that thinking much easier, because it gives you the option of going, that's my third option. It's probably the easiest one.
And just in terms of how do you think about what you might do if it didn't work out? I mean, I can see the sort of immediate repercussions for me in this, but for you, how would you have picked that up or dealt with it in the kind of team situation?
I mean, it just would have affected. It would have just meant hiring, and I think, everyone probably on this sort of Zoom meeting knows that hiring and stuff is just the most painful part of any business, really. It's just so that it would have been a pain around who's going to, first off, people in the business who that's not their job, they would have been given this work to do, and then it would have been at the same time hiring someone in to do this. I think the impact, interesting on that, is that when we started doing this stuff, compared to now, hiring a body to do just this work would now be even more expensive to do than it was when we started. So actually the cost effectiveness of that has got better over time in the wild last year of pay. So I think that is the impact would also be financial, really. That would be I wouldn't want to go back to it.
I've asked Rupert a number of questions, but Sue would anybody else like to grill Rupert about anything?
I think if anyone else wants to, just put your hand up or put in the chat. But I think the interesting thing for me was just that it's almost been a confidence journey. You started with one, tested the water, dipped your toe, and expanded with others because you started building that relationship and bringing in the co-sourcing relationship rather than just a very transactional. So I think it is interesting. And then because of that, and obviously you've had good experiences with Cognition, that you've gone now to other outsourcing partners as well for the areas that you can't do or don't want to do in-house. So interesting journey.
Yeah, it has been. I wanted to say something actually to the before we sort of for the out that when Matthew said, you know, think about what it is, why have you done this stuff? And I think it's in your co-sourcing checklist, which is I think is important there, is that, you know, I have, you know, as a publisher, you have a history of hiring freelancers and groups and what have you. And I think one of the big differences was when you thought, rather than hiring a contractor, which I would naturally have thought to do this work, is that, you know, is this SLAs thing. So when you hire individuals and freelancers to carry out stuff, you know, you have to have a kind of human relationship with them, which is quite symmetrical. And you're very reliant on them. And so actually, and over time that gets, shall we say, more involved or worse, depending on how you put it. And so I think one of the really interesting things about even doing the stuff that I might think of as a freelance work to do, going to an outsourcer, was that I can go, actually, no, I've got an SLA with you. There's a management structure that I can speak to that gets something done. And there is a process by which we can make sure that something is delivered on time. And I don't have to, it sounds like a strange thing to say, but it's nice to have a more asymmetric, you know, relationship that you go, I'm the client, you're the outside business. That's how I want it done. And I want it done that way every time. And I don't want to have to kind of chat with you about it in the sense of like, how can you do it this week, or can I wait until Friday? That stuff just doesn't happen. And I think that's kind of been, and the SLAs are in here. That's the upside for it.
But you did also say that it was very important to you that you had a personal relationship with the people who were taking on these tasks. And I think not to contradict what you know,
they're not
they weren't people. You wanted them to be integrated into your team. And I mean, how did you sort of address that aspect?
I think that's one of those things that you do have to make sure that you outline to everybody, you know, who's dealing with the outsourcer in the business, especially editorial. You go, look, you know, you do have to say, you know, I want you to make sure that you learn about these people, you know, talk to them like they're a member of the team, you know, sort of get their name right and that sort of stuff, and you know, and be nice, and you know, they're not just someone you're dumping content on. You know, you really do have to just treat them like you would someone who works in the business, who you're going to do this, and to have a personal relationship, because at some point you're going to screw up or they're going to screw up, and you're going to want to have a human conversation about it afterwards. So I don't think they're not in conflict with the idea of saying, but I also don't want to have to negotiate with you as all these individuals. But you definitely do want, you definitely want them to the team internally to feel like there is a human being, and that's who they're handing content to.
Thank you very much. So any more questions from the floor, or any questions from the floor for Rupert?
No, I think we can just crack on with your very handy checklist. I think that's really useful. What's coming up next?
Well, thank you. I hope that's a view sort of commonly shared. I must confess that when I was sharing this with Rupert in advance of this call, he did make the point that I didn't share this with him when our negotiations were starting. So, but anyway, there you have it. But really, what we're trying to do here, I think there's 12 or so kind of broad categories, which I hope help give some kind of context around deciding both what you should be outsourcing and also the questions that you should be asking when you're first talking to vendors. And as I say, these are a mixture of the things that we've been asked, but also that we asked of those people in our supply chain, but we're outsourcing. And I think, as I say, possibly not going through every single question, but I mean, obviously you want to understand what the experience and expertise is, not just in terms of being able to, for instance, if we look at Rupert's example, not just the experience of uploading that type of content or using those systems, but do you have any experience in the legal sector? All of this is obviously very, very kind of useful. And I mean, also the ongoing capabilities and the sort of tech stack and other sort of abilities to sort of work seamlessly. So we can obviously use Rupert's existing content systems and work in a way that makes that seamless. And I know we've spoken quite a bit just with Rupert about getting the integration and sort of collaboration around the team and the processes, but just how are you proposing to manage that? And, in Rupert's case, we had a series of kind of training and onboarding sessions, so it's important, obviously. And in terms of also the accountability, so your quality assurance and performance metrics, so just really understanding what success looks like and how that is being adhered to. Really, often in this case, you're dealing with sensitive information. I mean, I don't suppose Rupert stuff is necessarily commercially sensitive, but the sponsors certainly want to know where it's going and being managed and held in obviously a responsible way, aligned to some GDPR and all those other kind of local and regional data processes. So again, what is your expect very, very past answers to those questions with all the sort of supporting certification, etc. And again, I would always advocate with anything kind of starting small and scaling from there. So how are you proposing to do that? And often there's no kind of regular cadence in these processes as well. So how can you address those peaks and troughs, and what is the planning in that? And also what is the capability if we change slightly and we don't need things to be delivered at the same volume or the same cadence? Are you going to hold us to this for whatever that period of time is, or do you have this inherent flexibility in your model that supports that? Again, so much trust going into this to such important processes. How is that being relayed to the management team and the other stakeholders, and how is that going to be done in a kind of consistent way so that you have this ongoing overview of what is actually happening? So I suppose it kind of almost goes without saying, but we don't get asked for references and case studies maybe quite as often as you might expect, but it would be something that I would always recommend that you insist on. And also having that opportunity to speak to existing clients, I think is absolutely key. And certainly, as I say, within our supply chain, that is something that we would always be most insistent upon. And of course, cultural fit, are we aligned to objectives? I think it's interesting what Rupert was saying about, you want that balance, I think, between having somebody who is a member of your team, but also somebody who is, I would suggest, committed to delivering what they promised to deliver in a way that is beyond that of an in-house employee. And I think that's quite an interesting balancing act that needs to be addressed. And the ability to support this obviously on a long-term basis. And finally, what is the exit strategy? How is this going to end? And if it does end, what is the process for transitioning whatever you happen to be doing, either back in-house or even to another vendor? And I it's not a nice thing to hear when you're the vendor, but if something is going to competitor, you still have to be still in a position to help with that transition, really. Again, we're going to share all of this, and we'd hope that you could be able to have this to hand. But Any questions or anything that you'd like to ask from this?
I think nothing's come through yet on the chat. I think that just means you've answered everyone's questions, Matthew. That's really
well, I hope
informative and
so.
very useful.
I don't know if that's Rupert. So, is there you know, any of these sort of particularly stood out for you? Maybe just I know we're sort of coming up on our time, but
I think all I would add here, if anyone's on this call is thinking about doing this with anybody, is this point about for things like content, and I would guess almost anything, but certainly one of the things that it's easy to get into is that you think you're going to be able to just go, well, here's some content, there's our site, get on with it, and you do have to kind of, Matthew mentioned it about the energy client in a different way, but there is quite a lot of front loading about this, and you do have to accept it in a way. You know, for us, it was basically exactly the same as if we had hired a new person. They had to be trained how to do our content and everything else in exactly the same way as if we'd hired someone. And I kind of didn't see that coming. It was a bit stupid. It was obvious that's what it should be, but I just didn't, for some reason, didn't think it would be like that. And so you are training somebody or a group of people, in a sense, through training sessions about in exactly the same way that you would train someone, and that takes time. And there is a time barrier to training someone and getting them to understand the content and what it's about. You're not just saying it's any old crap, here it is, upload it. You do the same thing as that. So I think if you should always go into those things going, any outsourcing thing about this, you are going to have some of the same onboarding as you had with an in-house person, and to accept that, and there is a time barrier to getting people on.
But I assume that's kind of once, and then you won't have to do it again because you've now onboarded your outsourcing partner. So it will be less painful if there's changes.
That is one of those things that if there's someone else in Cognition who's going to take it over and do something, that I would personally expect the outsourcer to train that other person based on the playbook that they've got. And so yes, in theory, you benefit later. That is, for me, just another facet of resilience, rather than necessarily something useful in itself. But what I'm trying to say really is that, you know, it's no more painful than onboarding a new person. Really, that's it. But you do have to do it. It isn't. You can't fire and forget.
I think in that instance, we have sort of learned and retained the knowledge of what that function needs to do. So if somebody were to move or change, you know, obviously these are still people, they have lives, things happen, things go on, but that is then kept to a minimum in terms of, you know, you're not starting from scratch, and potentially you I guess would be if you were looking to have a full-time employee. So I just add that point really. Okay, well, we've got Q&A, but I think if we've answered all the questions, I don't know if anyone has any questions, or I mean, obviously very happy to pick up anything up offline or pick anything up in that capacity, but anybody like to?
I think I've put Matthew and Rupert's details in the chat if anybody wants to contact them directly. I think you probably won't get complained at if you finish a few minutes early, Matthew.
Okay, all right, well, no problem. So I mean, just in terms of conclusions, you know, we feel that co-sourcing gives you this access to specialized expertise, and in a very kind of scalable and aligned way, and in a way that I think actually allows you to kind of test ideas potentially as well. You know, there's always this expression that you can't get a little bit pregnant. I think potentially with outsourcing and co-sourcing, you actually can. And as I say, we just, you know, I think the other thing that you really want to be looking from a co-sourcing partner is somebody who just wants to take that time to really understand you and your business objectives, and is looking through the world really through your eyes. And as Rupert's been quite clear about, the first stages of it can be a bit more intense perhaps than you're expecting, in terms of that effort you have to put in training and helping people understand the sort of tasks or the objectives. But I think obviously can be worth that. I think it's extremely important to think about what happens if it doesn't work out, and where you go, and what the sort of what the processes are potentially for bringing that back in-house. I know it's the biggest cliche in the world, but hoping for the best and planning for the worst is always, I think, extremely prudent in any kind of capacity. But just as I say, just understanding that the relationship just doesn't have to be forever. If we look at those energy aspects examples, it was to test an idea, and actually to see whether there was a capacity to build that function in-house in a sort of lower risk environment. So I think in conclusion, it's just a really good way to sort of test new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new approaches. So if anybody has anything else, or if there are no questions, I guess 2 minutes early on this, but that's probably all right, I imagine, with most people. I just would very much like to thank Rupert for his contribution and for giving time to help, and of course Sue and the Renewed team for giving us the opportunity, and last but not least, everybody who's listened to what we've had to say. And we're really friendly, really open people. We try not to be too salesy, so if you've got any questions or anything, we'd love to just try and help on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Rupert, and thank you everyone for attending. If you do have any questions, I will be emailing out the recording and the slides with all the contact details that you'll need. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.